If you're just joining us or you're staying with us, welcome back. This is day 2 of the series of short conversations with people whose knowledge, whose experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right of return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide that are a century in the making. Please come and go over the course of these next 2 conversations as you wish. I am Sabina Vaught, and I'm really honored to be welcoming Dr. Jennifer Kelly. Jennifer, I think you're with us. Hello. Dr. Kelly is Associate Professor in the Department of Feminist Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she's also affiliated with the Center for the Middle East and North Africa. Among a number of other courses, she teaches comparative settler colonial studies and militarism and tourism. Dr. Kelly is the author of Invited to Witness Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine, a new book, which I'm going to get and read. With co-editors Samdeep Sen and Leela Sharif, Dr. Kelly's current project is entitled Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Palestine. This is an edited volume that considers how Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora assert their connections to their homeland, often via initiatives that resemble tourism. So there's a much longer bio. We're trying to be quick and make space to hear from you as much as we can. So we welcome you, Dr. Kelly, and we thank you so very much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so appreciative of what you're doing, especially in terms of, we've been talking a lot at Santa Cruz about how to make space in the classroom, to pause business as usual, and to insist on equipping educators with knowledge about how to intervene in this horrific genocide that we're witnessing. So I think you all are doing the work of providing those resources to people, and I'm really appreciative of it.
It's the least we can do. Oh, I want to start off by sharing that you write that you, quote, analyze the complex ways in which solidarity tourism has emerged in Palestine as an organizing strategy that is both embedded in and working against histories of sustained displacement. And I'm wondering if you can just explain to organizers in particular on the call, educators too, what was this practice of solidarity tourism? I think we just love to learn what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my book is on solidarity tourism across occupied Palestine. So it analyzes the practice, the phenomenon since the first Intifada of bringing international tourists to Palestine to witness the effects of Israeli state violence and to work toward Palestinian liberation. And I talk a lot in the book, I kind of trace the history of how solidarity tourism became professionalized in the wake of the Oslo Accords, how it moved from a more clandestine, less institutionalized form of delegations and tourists coming to Palestine, but also what has stayed the same. So I trace what is different and also what has stayed the same. And one of the things that is really, I think, crucial for our conversations now is that so much of solidarity tourism is predicated on the notion that tourists need to see it to believe it. And so the idea that tourists need to come to Palestine to witness, right, that they're invited to come to Palestine to witness. One thing that is really central in the book is asking why that is, right, and talking about how the phenomenon of solidarity tourism exists as a practice because Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators of their own condition, which requires international internationals to come to Palestine. It requires international presence to corroborate Palestinian narratives and analyses of Israeli occupation. And these are narratives and analyses that have long been in the historical record. Like, this is a practice of accumulating evidence when evidence already abounds. And it's a phenomenon that insists that we ask why the accumulation of evidence of Israeli state violence continues to be the ask when that evidence is so ubiquitous, right? And so much about it is about why and how tourists are asked to corroborate Palestinian narratives of their own displacement. And that is a underpinning of solidarity tourism as a phenomenon. And then the other part of that is that Palestinian tour guides are constantly both pointing that out and intervening in tourist expectations for what they're witnessing in Palestine. So I think tourists come to Palestine with a host of expectations. One is that they may come to Palestine to sort of volunteer or stay for long amounts of time, and they're consistently met with the response that your work is not here. So, like, welcome to Palestine, your work is not here. So come, learn, spend 10 days here, 7 to 10 days here, 2 hours, whatever you have, and please go home and do your work there. So I think that is one sort of expectation that gets turned on its head on the part of tourists in Palestine. And the other is that tourists in Palestine often carry with them expectations that they're going to be kind of met with Palestinians performing their subjection for tourists, and Palestinians intervene in that as a practice too, right? So intervene in that kind of like desire for evidence, desire for Palestinian tour guides and hosts displaying their wounds for tourists and having tourists sort of consume that. And so I think what is especially important to like take from that now is that we, of course, are witnessing a genocide like live streamed on Instagram, right? And every day Israel is murdering more Palestinians. Every day we see more of this carnage. And we know, of course, the US is funding it. We know, of course, that the weapons are manufactured in the US. And still, while we are witnessing this, Palestinians are still not treated as reliable narrators, right? They're still accused of bombing their own hospitals. They're still accused of fabricating the numbers of their dead, right? And so the practice, the underpinning of solidarity tourism, the need to see it to believe it, this accumulation of evidence when evidence already abounds, all speaks to this very real underlying sort of thing that dictates how everything we're witnessing is perceived, which is where Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators and not treated as capable of theorizing their own conditions. And so I think, for me at least, one of the asks as educators is to understand what not only what we're witnessing, right, but to be able to describe what we're witnessing to students and describe how what we're witnessing is obfuscated through this lens of treating Palestinians as though they're not reliable narrators and need corroboration from non-Palestinians. And so for me and for my students, and what I sort of take from that and give to them is a grounding in Palestinian studies and an insistence that witnessing does not supplant study, and witnessing does not supplant research, and the sort of grounding that Palestinian studies like offers in these horrific moments is where students need to go, right? What the kind of study that students are asked to do on top of all of the sort of organizing to end the genocide that we're witnessing.
Thank you for that. You're brilliant. I mean, that was amazing. The sort of nutshell way you did pulled all of that together, and I was taking notes and trying to process. And I guess I have two, immediate questions, but there may be other directions you want to go. So please, like, ignore my questions if you want to take us in another direction. But two things that kind of came up as you were talking about sort of Palestinian people not being understood as legitimate narrators over a century. I mean, this is, as you said, there's this immediate thing happening, but this is a long process. But also, what does that mean for Palestinian people across diaspora? What does that mean for narration in relation to right of return, to sort of occupation, to decolonization? How is that narration or its function playing out globally? And then, another question I had is, how is this sort of related to, or not, maybe this larger, it's not larger, this other practice that, Teresa Tewa called militarism. There were a couple study groups over the last many months where some of the people on this call studied that. And sort of, is there a larger question or a sort of set of liberatory frameworks you might help people think through in terms of relating in solidarity? That's a whole lot. And again, you could pick or
no, I love those questions. I think I'm going to start with the second one because I think it relates to how, like, a lot of us who have been doing the sort of teach-ins hosted in critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz have been trying to make that a space for example, faculty who aren't sure how to bring this into the classroom and want guidance, especially for TAs, teaching assistants, who want to do this work in their sections, but are doing so without the support of their professors, for K through 12 educators, for anyone who needs some guidance around how to do this work and how to make space for it in the classroom. And I think the question around militarism helps answer that as well, because one of the students we spoke to was like, I'm teaching a TV studies class, and like, of course, this has everything to do with TV studies and representational practice and media representations, and how we understand what we're viewing, like how we do what we're taught to do otherwise, right? Like critically analyze the racialized and gendered formations of media representations, right? And the militarism is, and this was advice that I got from my one of my advisors, Naomi Paik, early on in the dissertation writing, was like, you want to bring Palestine, figure out a way to bring Palestine to people who are interested in tourism, but not necessarily have any sort of knowledge base around Palestine, or interested in militarism, but don't know a lot about Palestine, and how to like stage these conversations as a way in to be able to make space for talking about the Nakba, for talking about over 75 years of displacement, right? For talking about contemporary state violence, talking about settler, but like all of these things, and finding a way to bring them into the classroom. And I think the question of militarism, it allows you to do that, because there's so much in the sort of study of that phenomenon. And I'm sure in reading her work, you spoke a lot about Hawaii, right? And so like the study of militarism in Hawaii was so formative for my understanding of how tourism functioned under military occupation in Palestine, even though the way that tourism is packaged in each site looks very different, right? And so from everything from kind of like what is often considered like an obfuscation of militarism in tours to Israel, like birthright, which I find much less an obfuscation than a celebration, right? Because like IDF soldiers are leading tours, they're imbricated in the fabric of birthright. So it's something where like the militarism is actually on stark display and celebrated. And I think that's true. And I think that's what the kinds of like detours in Hawaii have have underscored that too. Like, what do we do when militarism is not only obfuscated but also celebrated, and also both disappeared and also takes up so much space, right? And so I think that those are ways in for students too, to do like a comparative studies together about how tourism functions in Palestine and how tourism functions in Hawaii, and how we can think about militarism, and how we can think about what happens in these what we assume happens on these kinds of tours and what actually happens, right? So from everything from like the obfuscation of militarism to the kind of assumption that solidarity tourism in Palestine is just occupation tourism, or is just kind of occupation like voyeurism, which to me, like I've worked against that dismissal since the beginning, because it dismisses the labor of Palestinian tour guides who do this work every day and who show up every day and do all this extensive research and extensive study to lay out for tourists what they're witnessing, in spite of the sort of violence of that the violence of the site of knowledge production in that interaction, despite the fraught terrain of tourism, despite the fact that tourists come expecting to see this sort of a tour of suffering, and tour guides providing that evidence, but also intervening in the ask for that evidence, right? So I think this kind of like dismissal around the forms and shapes that we think we understand about tourism and militarism, and an actual like really deep study of these practices allows students a way in when they might understand something about Hawaii, but they might not know anything about Palestine, or vice versa. And I think the other thing that's important here is I've had way too many people in the past 30 days and before suggest somehow that nuance is that nuance is synonymous with like both sides, or some kind of like normalization narrative, and the subtext of that is that you cannot have anti-Zionist, anti-colonial critique with nuance, right? And so I think that tourism is one of the sites that tells us, like, how do you have a deeply anti-Zionist study, a deeply anti-colonial study that also details the nuance of anti-colonial movement work, right? And doesn't allow nuance to just be like the province of people who are too fearful to actually name and identify what we're witnessing.
There are a number of things there, but one thing I wanted to reiterate for educators is something you said in your first remarks and then emphasized again, which is there are ways, as I heard you, correct me if I'm wrong, rather than perhaps if a TA wants to bring the considerations and questions of Palestine to a class, that one sort of pedagogical and curricular strategy for that is to bring it through the topic or the disciplinary area. So through tourism, through TV, through whatever the disciplinary or field-based area might be. And I thought that was such a important point to reiterate, that there are routes of access or points of entry that will help people engage in conversation, and people who are teaching from perhaps more vulnerable positions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also goes up against the kind of I think we're seeing some of this, and I think we'll see more, is like a flurry of administrators wanting to suggest that you can't change your syllabus right in the middle of a course. That is, I think, a response to Palestine showing up in the classroom and wanting to make sure that that's silenced, right? And so one way of thinking about this is demanding the relevance of Palestine in almost everything we teach, right? And demanding that this is not a departure. One, that we have that it's absolutely in our right as educators to pause business as usual, to make space in our class for students to like comprehend this catastrophic world that they're trying to make sense of, right? And two, that there is a relevance, there's an argument about relevance to be made in almost every course that we teach, and that part of our task as educators is guiding our students through being able to do that kind of analysis and make those kind of comparative, do that kind of comparative study and ground their work in study. And so I think it's really necessary for that reason. And then another reason is the kind of, I think there, you know, as we know, like one of the most frequently used arguments to shut down conversation on Palestine is to say it's too complicated, right? And to sort of reproduce a lot of the what masquerades as like disciplinary gatekeeping, but which is actually just a way to keep Palestine out of classrooms. And I think that identifying that for what it is one part of this, and the other part is insisting that educators don't need to know everything that's ever happened in Palestine to be able to talk to their students about how to navigate the information they're receiving, right, and critically analyze it and deconstruct the misinformation campaigns that they're confronted with every time they consume any kind of media, and understanding that teaching them how to do that and teaching them about a genocide that they're living through and witnessing is crucial work, right? And that is not work that need only fall on people who are experts, right, or see themselves as experts of long histories of Palestine.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing for educators. I wonder if we could shift a tiny bit. On Friday, Nadine Neber, charged us to understand Palestinian liberation as a queer issue. And this morning, Neda Elia talked about pinkwashing. And I know you've published and written on pinkwashing in relation to Palestine and to solidarity tourism. And I wonder if you could kind of anchor us there, not just as sort of a description of what it is, but also as, ways to actively resist, to sort of join in struggle against that.
Absolutely. And I think so. The piece, one of the things that I wrote about pinkwashing was exactly what I was talking about earlier, in terms of the way that like pinkwashing is sometimes understood as solely obfuscation, right? And solely a sort of celebration of queer freedoms in Israel as a way to like paper over Israeli human rights violations and Israeli state violence. But one of the things I write about in that piece is actually, as I look at LGBT birthright initiatives and how LGBT birthright initiatives are not divorced from Israeli state violence and militarism, in the sense that they are led by soldiers, right? That soldiers are tour guides, and that Israeli militarism is celebrated on LGBT birthright. That Israeli narratives of defense are circulated in these programs, right? And that those programs are part and parcel of larger Zionist state narratives. So I think that that understanding like what is at work in LGBT birthright, and also other kinds of forms of tourism that traffic in all of these like pinkwashing tropes, like what is actually at work on those tours and in those ad campaigns and in those programs. Because what is at work is, as so many scholars of pinkwashing have shown, right, what is at work is it's really the justificatory logic for Israeli state violence and displacement. So it's using these narratives of that really hinge on like a lot of the tourist narratives really hinge on like queer freedom of mobility. So it's like you can go here and you can go here and you can do this and you can hold your hands in public and you can like all of these things that are sort of circulating this idea of Israel as like a queer haven. And I think that so much queer Palestinian organizing has said, has of course has named that, has identified that, has resisted that, has theorized that, and how those tours function and how they what they obscure and also what they reveal and celebrate. And I think one of the most important things was when there was a homo nationalism and pinkwashing conference, I think in 2011, and one of the queer Palestinian organizers, Haneen Mikey, said, you know, are you in solidarity with queer Palestinians or are you in solidarity with Palestine? Right. And so I think, and this is one of the things that I talk about with tour guide interlocutors all the time, is this idea of one, and Mohammed Al-Kard has talked about this a lot recently, like the perfect victim, right? And the other is this idea of sameness and sort of wanting to identify, like thinking about, and I think that this is what I think about when I think about solidarity tourism a lot, is like what is the strategy and what gets lost in the strategy and what are the stakes of the strategy. And so you can think about this with like Christian Zionist, like the ubiquity of Christian Zionism, and then Christian anti-Zionist tourism to Palestine, or Christian anti-Zionist work, which is so crucial for combating Christian Zionism, but cannot do so under any sort of exceptionalization of Christian Palestinians, right? And so I think that these kinds of questions are necessary as people do this work, do the solidarity work, interrogate the solidarity work they're doing, and think about the kinds of stakes and claims of their strategies as they're sort of responding to state violence, and think about what those stakes are and what they traffic in and what they might obscure themselves.
So I just want to repeat for people your first three questions, because I think this is helpful for organizing and for teaching. So what is the strategy? What gets lost in the strategy? What are the stakes of the strategy? Did I get those right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are questions we can ask ourselves in our pedagogy, in our curriculum. So what's the strategy? What gets lost? And what are the stakes? Such an important framing. I want to give people a chance to drop questions in the chat if they have any. I also want to give you a chance to go in a direction that I haven't identified. So things that you think we should be thinking about, or that you want to share with educators and organizers.
Yeah, I think that, so when I've been talking to, doing this kind of like teaching work, talking to other educators, and I think one thing that's really important for students, at least for my students, like what I start all my classes with, is the question of political education, and is the importance of not disaggregating study from struggle. And so I always share with them Rachel Herzing's articulation of study and struggle in the wake of George Floyd's murder, right, where she said that this distinction between study and struggle misses the point, and that the purpose of political education is to strengthen our movement work, right? And so I think that I'm kind of like, for me, I'm kind of always trying to like anchor these conversations in Palestinian studies, because so much of the book is like the way that tourists and delegates can use witnessing as an alibi for research, or do witness instead of doing research. And to me, it's such an important thing to return to the research. And it's not a sort of distancing abstraction from the work, the movement work itself. It's actually like a very grounding and important decision to make. So I think understanding that the connection and necessity of study and struggle together is one thing that sort of like we cannot abandon a study. This is not a moment to abandon study, right? And so I share with my students, much like Donna was talking about earlier, the Nakba curriculum. I share with my students a Palestinian studies reading list. I point them to Palestine in Praxis, the Scholars for Palestinian Freedom's public letter in the wake of the last bombing campaign in Gaza, which was a demand to meaningfully engage Palestine in our classroom, not as a case study among other, not only as a case study among others, but actually to like do deep study in our classrooms, research, and institutions, right? And so I think that is a sort of anchor for me that I share with students in these moments. And then I can share all of the resources. The other things that I would share too are, the ADL is sending pamphlets home with K through 12 students, and that of course conflate Zionism with and conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and see any critique of Israel as anti-Semitic. And so some of my friends and colleagues have organized a Gaza for Parents and Educators toolkit, which is anti-racist and anti-colonial, and is a Q&A and links to Palestinian and Jewish voices, and uses sort of age-appropriate language. So that's one resource I've been sharing. And then another is How to Talk to Your Kids About Palestine, which is for like even littler. My baby's a 2-year-old, so thinking about like how to do this pedagogically in the classroom, but also with our babies, also for my students, nieces and nephews. So I have those resources I can share as well. And then I can look in the chat for questions.
Yeah, and I'm looking to, yes, if you're able to share resources when you're done talking, you don't have to multitask. That'd be great. And we'll add them to a list we have of resources people shared. I do think a question came in asking about, the ethics maybe of sharing images in education and in generating resistance to Israel's genocidal violence. Media images seem important but insufficient. That said, aren't images, and I'm imagining these are images, for instance, from Palestinian journalists in Gaza, aren't they more powerful than numbers, or I think sort of information? And so I guess your help in thinking with educators about what it means to look at images of genocide in real time, and particularly when many people in Gaza are asking everyone to repost, like what are the tensions or struggles there for you, or how do you think about that with educators?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really important question. I think that one way to sort of do this for students that I've been sharing with them is one, like lists of journalists in Gaza to follow, right? To share with them to talk a lot about the many multifaceted ways that Israel is, from everything from cutting off electricity to murdering Palestinian journalists, is trying to make sure that these images and these stories and these narratives are not shared, right? I think in terms of the space of the classroom, so I give them sort of resources to follow to be able to do that research. I give them ways and avenues aside from just sort of the Palestinian studies reading list, but also in this moment, who and how to have access to that information. And also I am essentially like constantly telling them to look to independent media, so to look to Democracy Now! For coverage of the sort of rarity of having Palestinians talk about Palestine, right? As opposed to the sort of ubiquity of journalists speaking for, or reporters speaking for Palestine. And so in the space of the classroom, what I've found pedagogically invaluable is to share with them things like Rafik Sayada's "We Teach Life, Sir," right, which is a poem from 2011. I can put it in the chat as well. And so when I share this with students, I talk about, it's a poem about the sort of media demand for sound bites and the media demand for like human stories that are apolitical, and the ask that is constantly like foisted upon Palestinians to do the work of coming up with the perfect soundbite, the perfect image, the perfect story, the perfect human story, the perfect human story that isn't tied to politics. And I think that she does that so beautifully in that poem that I share that with students. And when I've been sharing that with students, I've also been sharing with them videos from Palestinian journalists in this moment. For example, like with kids playing, right? And a big part of my chapter on Gaza is about how Banksy did this installation piece that was meant to sort of make a mockery of tourism in Gaza. And the Palestinian Gaza parkour team responded with a video of their own, being like, "We would love to host tourists, and if we could, this is what we would show them." And it sort of turned that sort of mockery on its head. And part of that was also foregrounding like play and foregrounding like Palestinian joy against this like murderous machinery of airstrikes and violence. And I think for me that is pedagogically necessary in my classroom, also because I don't assume that my student, I don't know who I mean, sometimes I'm teaching big lectures, I'm doing a lot of guest lecturing in other people's classes. I don't know who the students are, and I'm not going to assume that there are not Palestinian students in those classes. And so for me to do that work pedagogically, I think it's important to emphasize the steadfastness of teaching life, of what she calls teaching life, right? The cultivation of Palestinian joy, the insistence on care. And one of the things that I just came from the American Studies Association conference in Montreal, and so many of us in Palestinian studies were talking across our work in this moment and talking about the kind of ubiquity, and several scholars have made this argument around the circulation of women and children as like Maya Mikdashi wrote about this, and Jadalia, Mohammed Al-Kurd's recent talk was on this, but the ubiquity of the women and children as the kind of the real victims of Israeli state violence, which ignores Palestinian men, of course, or treats them as already suspect. And so one of the things that I've been sharing with students too is just so many of these images are fathers carrying their babies, right? And pulling, like, protect, like doing everything that they can to protect their babies. And so I think that this is a moment where it is incumbent upon us as editors to show the pedagogy of life in Gaza right now. And I think that that is another moment of where evidence abounds, and it's just about pulling that evidence for our students and allowing them to see that. And that's especially important for me for any Palestinian students in the classroom, who every time they open their phone are seeing a genocide live streamed, to be able to introduce their peers not only to accuracy around what's actually happening, but also to this long practice of teaching life in Palestine.
I'm so grateful that you brought us here. I was in another conversation where we were talking about not only fathers, but men who don't know the babies, who don't know the children, who are expressing care that is it is clearly, for lack of a better word, skilled, right? That communicates something about ongoing practice and values and principles. So I appreciate that you brought us back to that even in the horror, the paying attention to the living, the life, and to be observing and learning all the time. And I think on that note, I've kept you here past our agreed time, and I'm so grateful and feel like we could talk to you forever. And I know my dear friend and colleague, Lisa Ortiz, who's on the call and who said, you should invite this person, will be really sad to see you go. But I want to thank you. I want to appreciate the time and energy you gave to us, the sort of deep commitment of your life's work. And hope that you and your loved ones are okay in this time.
Thank you so much. And also for just anyone on the call, I'm happy to be a resource for whatever you need. Yeah. In terms of doing this in the class, I'm also a founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. So in terms of thinking, like you were on the last call, about the deep study of Zionism, like any kind of things you need, resources you need, sources you need, anything for the classroom, please just feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat as well. Thank you so much for inviting me and facilitating these conversations.
Thank you so very much.